This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please rate and review the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, rate the podcast on Spotify, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. If you are doubting, deconstructing, going through the dark night of the soul, you do not have to do that alone. Join our private Facebook group, Deconversion Anonymous, and be amongst friends. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Next week's guest is Holly Laurent from the Mega Podcast. Holly and the Mega Podcast crew are amazingly funny, and now they're about to do a special series that you're going to love. Mega is an improvised satire in a world of a fictional megachurch, and they're releasing a comedy investigation miniseries inside the world of their own show called The Rise and Fall of Twin Hills. The Rise and Fall of Twin Hills is a hilarious riff on the self-important truth-seeking that happens around church scandals and the twisted psychology of those who are inside them. This miniseries is chock full of ridiculous scandal. Put it this way, if you think that the real megachurch pastors' improprieties we've seen over the last few years are bad, get ready for the outlandish hijinks of Pastor Stephen Judson. If you're a fan of great comedy, parody, or just want a lighthearted take on deconstructing the harmful beliefs we know so well, then go check out Mega and their new miniseries that comes out on May 21st. My favorite past episodes have awesome guests like Cicely Strong and Louis Anderson. So look up Mega now and follow them. You're not going to want to miss The Rise and Fall of Twin Hills. It's on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. Arlene interviews this week's guest, Josh Keijzer. Josh calls himself a radical theologian. He no longer calls himself a Christian. You can find him on Instagram at After God's End, and he brings a really interesting perspective to the table. Josh is Dutch. The discussion that Arlene and Josh get into reflects on the differences between the Netherlands and the United States. Near the end, Arlene and Josh talk a bit about postmodernism, and Josh begins to describe something that I would call secular grace. Here is Arlene interviewing Josh Keijzer.
Hi, Josh. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you, Arlene.
I'm super excited. A past guest, Pawnee George, sent me your information and said, hey, he may want to be on the show. And I reached out, and I was already following you on Instagram. So I was excited when you said yes. And I'm excited to hear your story. So the way we usually begin is just tell us about the religious environment that you grew up in and tell your story.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me on the podcast, and I'm excited to tell a bit about myself.
Yay.
I'm from the Netherlands, and I have studied in the United States from 2009 to 2017, so it was a long time. An MA in Christian thought, and then a PhD in systematic theology.
Oh, wow.
And so I left America. Actually, I wanted to stay in America and teach at a college, but the whole theology thing in academia was collapsing. So an early sign of, I would say, the de-Christianization or the upcoming de-Christianization of the U.S. Anyway, so I had to leave, and after returning to the Netherlands, I was not able to make any significant, meaningful theological connections. So my academic life finished with me leaving America. And now I'm a copywriter and enjoying it very much, and taking on bigger names and bigger jobs. And I'm a ghostwriter now. I write books for companies and for people. And I'm always able to throw in quite a bit of my theological heritage, even though I'm no longer a professing Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I started by being born in the Netherlands a long time ago in the 60s. And it was only much later, let's say, toward the end of my stay in America, that I finally realized that I had been brought up as an evangelical, as an American evangelical,
Oh, wow.
and specifically have to attach evangelical to the nomenclature because um, I realized that growing up as a Christian, we were always set apart. We were part of a minority, and we had our network of people. We were not alone as a family and as a church, but we also didn't really fit into the wider scheme of things. We were, strangers in a strange land. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so later I realized, oh, that's because I was an American evangelical. And so I've always had a deep interest in America. I also had family in the States, in the Seattle area. My uncle and aunt emigrated to the United States in the 60s. So there was kind of an infatuation, like America was the real deal. That's where, that's the origin of my faith and the whole shebang. So I grew up as an American evangelical, and we met American missionaries who would come over to Europe, and my father was very much in love with an organization that originated in America by the name of Operation Mobilization,
Okay.
and he always wanted to join that organization. He didn't, but eventually I did, and I spent a couple of years with Operation Mobilization on one of their ships initially until it sank in South America, and then stuck around for a total of 8 years with that organization. During that time, I also wrote a course for like missionary awareness. So deeply invested, and
Yeah.
later I did my bachelor in theology and biblical studies. Um, and then eventually I ended up in advertising as a graphic designer and later as an art director. But I was not really satisfied intellectually, I guess. And so it feels like I had an intellectual awakening. And then we're talking like early 40s. But the intellectual awakening was accompanied by a renewed interest in the sources of my faith and the foundations of my Christian faith. So I got deeply interested in apologetics, and which is the defense of the Christian faith.
Yes.
Yep, lots of that in the U.S. And I applied to go to a seminary applied for a seminary in the U.S. for my master's, and then got admitted at a Christian thought program. And by then I'm in my 40s. So that's where I come from.
Yes. Wow. Okay. I'm curious, what is, you said you guys were set apart. You were clearly like this American version of evangelicalism. What is the like religious look of the Netherlands? Or is that it's very broad or is it very secular? I have no idea.
Oh, the Netherlands is very secular.
Okay.
So we experienced our de-Christianization moment in the 60s and the 70s. And by the 80s, basically nobody went to church anymore. When I say nobody, it's not entirely fair. There are still, a bunch of Catholics in the South, and
Okay.
we have strong roots in the Calvinistic Reformation,
Mm-hmm.
but it's only present mostly as a cultural memory, and it is not a there are, so we have our Bible Belt too, like you have in the US. We have our Bible Belt.
Mm-hmm.
It's really like a narrow strip that crosses the entire nation. It's like that's where the very conservative people live. And as an evangelical, I did not belong to them. I had my allegiance elsewhere.
So what did your upbringing look like? Like, was it church on the weekends, church on Wednesday night? That's what I think of evangelicalism, like the more modern music, or was it traditional? Was it at your home too? That was another
Yeah, so
thing.
my dad started a house church in
Oh, wow.
the late 60s, and I still have fond memories of that. I
Mhm.
don't subscribe to that faith anymore, but fond childhood memories of all the interesting stories of the things that happened there. But yeah, very much a kind of a brethren church. Met at a house and later at a synagogue that was no longer in use in our town.
Oh, wow.
and gathered with a group of people. I think the maximum number of members at one point was 80, 88 or something, usually much smaller.
Hmm.
But there were a lot of hypocrites around. And let me nuance that, because we're all hypocrites. We cannot get by in life without being hypocritical.
Oh, yeah.
But there's just like the basic level of hypocrisy, and then there's next level hypocrisy where people really try to achieve objectives with sneaky means. And so I met a lot of that. I met a lot of that. And so as a teenager, I struggled with my faith because I liked all the music of the world, and I liked punk music and new wave. You know, that we were talking about the 80s. And I was a member of a band. I was a singer and a keyboard player. And on the other hand, the faith thing. So I struggled with that. And now when I look back, I realize that even back then, the hypocrisy that people had, and not just general hypocrisy, but people who try to con my parents and
Oh, wow.
put them down and just humiliate them,
Hmm.
uh, and replace them. I guess it really did something to me at a subconscious level. I know that I always hated worship music. I just hated it. And luckily, being the pianist in church, you know, you just play along and you turn all those songs either in jazz or, you know, whatever you fancy. You improvise around the song, and so that was the fun part. But actually, I really hated worship music. I really hated it. I've always
Oh,
hated it.
wow. Hmm.
Yeah, interesting, right? So
Yeah, that,
was
yeah.
that already like an early rebellious response? I guess so. I guess like this didn't work for me. So and then later when I came to the U.S. to study theology, I was invested at a sort of an intellectual from an intellectual point of view, thinking that, you know, if you can nail down the intellectual foundation of Christianity, then you don't have to worry about the worship styles and stuff that I don't really care for. But then at least you're making a contribution at a very fundamental level. That kind of, I think that was my objective, and so you can make your contribution that way intellectually. But the culture never appealed to me.
Oh, that's fascinating. I liked a little bit of both of it. Like, I also have good memories. I did not grow up in the church, but my years in church, for the most part, were good. But I did. I liked the Hillsong music, but I also liked the reading all the dead white guy books. Like, so thinking back to when you were young and you're talking about being rebellious, like, young people often will take their beliefs very seriously. Like, if Jesus really is the only way to God and like all the stuff that you're being taught is true, when you see people's lives not be changed and the way they treat your family and the hypocrisy, it's much harder to like make it work, because it's like, if there really is a Holy Spirit who's supposed to be changing people, why am I seeing this kind of behavior from these people, especially the adults that you're supposed to look up to and things?
I was not self-differentiated enough, so in my view, it was just like my dad was being beleaguered by evil men, and
Yeah.
of course that's not what Christians were like. So there was something wrong, and maybe it was the devil.
Mm.
You know, he was waging a spiritual warfare here,
Oh,
and
goodness.
more along those lines. Yeah, yeah. So I think my rebelliousness is more at a subconscious level, and my hatred for worship music was a sign of that. It was a sign of things to come.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. So, yeah. So, what happened? Were there small things that happened that you started losing your beliefs or?
No, not at all. So I struggled with my faith, but I was committed, and I remained
Mhm.
committed. And by the time I had my intellectual revival or whatever you want, awakening, um, I was still firmly committed to the Christian faith, and had already gone through a couple of phases of like recommitment or deepening or whatever you want to call it. I don't care. But so no, the questioning started only at the seminary. That's where things started going haywire for me. There I was in the Midwest, and I had finally kind of achieved my dream, and so I was at the Walhalla of Christianity, so to speak, you know, or of my my blend of Christianity, And so now I had come to the truth, right? Now I would figure it all out.
Mm.
But then we were, and this is a personal anecdote, so I'm not going to go too deep into it if you don't mind. But in my family situation, stuff went really bad between me and my wife. And it resulted in me living alone on campus for the rest of my stay in America.
Oh, okay.
So that was a first dent. And I'm like, so how is this possible? The Lord guided us. It was God's will. But
Mm-hmm.
since God knows everything, He knew that this was going to happen. And so, how can a God make this happen? Why couldn't He have prevented us from going? Because then this wouldn't have happened. Blah 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 blah. So the questions start coming, and I guess I also met people at that seminary. It was a thoroughly, solidly evangelical seminary, but there were plenty of people who did a lot of questioning, and I have to credit them for opening my eyes. Like, hey, you can think differently. You don't have to be a fundamentalist. And one of the major insights was, and it was in my first year that I realized, hey, look, you can describe certain things as sin, over which people need to repent and then get right with the Lord. But you can also do family marriage therapy and then help them see where it comes from and not mention it as sin, and they start feeling much much better in the Lord. So that kind of thing, I realized that. Um,
Huh.
so I struggled along and tried to embrace some like postmodern notions, blah blah blah. But the big change for me came in my second year. I had a black classmate, and she posted something on Facebook at one evening where she narrated how she had been stopped by the police in her own neighborhood, and the police had told her, "Hey, you drove through a red light." And she had answered, "No, I didn't." And then the police officer said, "Okay, but next time, you better be careful." And so she narrated that. And suddenly it dawned on me, comparing myself with her situation. There she was in her own country, in her own neighborhood, having to experience these things on a regular basis. And here I was as a foreigner in America, driving my sports coupe vehicle, speeding everywhere all the time under any circumstance. Not worried. It's not in my mind that I should be worried about the police. And if I would have been stopped by the police, I would have thrown my hands in the air and say, "I'm sorry, officer. I'm not from here. Yeah, I'm from Europe, and we drive differently. I was just not thinking what I was doing. I'm sorry." They would have just let me get off. But hey, if you're black, it's a different story.
Ah. Mm-hmm.
Even in the northern parts of the Midwest, and and so I realized what was going on. I was given um, white privilege, even as a foreigner, and I was living it out subconsciously, like all these other white people around me. And she was not having any of that, and she had to be careful in her own neighborhood. So that set off a chain reaction. I finally started seeing racism from the inside. I was already pretty much aware of it, but I started seeing it from the inside. And next I realized that racism played a large part in how things were being done at my seminary and university,
Oh,
because they had
wow.
a diversity committee. Oh, sure. And guess who was on the diversity committee of this all white seminary? Black person X, black person Y, Asian person Z. And who was the president of the committee? Asian background professor,
Okay. Yeah.
or black African American professor. And so they were allowed to do their little thing in their little corner as long as the rest of them could just go on doing what they were doing.
It didn't look like anything was actually going to be changed or accommodated.
Not at a deep level, not at a deep level at all.
I see.
And then of course you start hearing the voices, and it started with like a theologian, like, what's his name? Never mind his name, doesn't matter. Like a very moderate, pretty conservative theologian who had with a Hispanic background.
Hmm.
He noted that, in history, the history of theology, that many decisions were made out of concerns of power and not concerns over truth. And so I started seeing more and more of that, and it became more and more uncomfortable. And so I would say that racism was the big changer for me, because how is it possible? There you have a seminary, and we all have the word of the Lord. The Bible is God's absolute word, and it contains God's absolute truth. And we are so lucky to have it and to understand how it works. And so let's expound the Bible more. Let's do a little bit more of Bible study or systematic theology, and get doctrinally righteous. But at the same time, these very people were not able, and still to this day and 10 years from now will not be able to address the latent, not just even latent, blatant racism in their system. So something broke.
Again, it goes back to, like, for me at least, I understood that the Bible, the Holy Spirit, all these different spiritual things were supposed to change people's lives. And when you watch people who have privilege and power use those things for more privilege and power, and not to take care of the groups of people that, when I would read the Gospels, and even the Old Testament prophets, it looked like this is the stuff that God cared about. Now I have a very, a different perspective on lots of parts of the Bible now, but Jesus seemed to hang out with the disenfranchised people. And yet we watch, especially white American evangelicalism, literally keep power and privilege for themselves and not want anything to change. Because why would they want things to change? Because then other people might have privilege and power, and they don't want to have to share anything. It's yeah, but it doesn't make any sense, because you'd think that they're being changed by this magical supernatural stuff.
Yeah, and so the funny thing is that I realized at one point that the entire theological structure,
Mm.
the way theology is set up, is a setup to avoid the moral consequences of the gospel, whatever the gospel may be. I don't know what the gospel is, but it's insane. So it always talks about the personal sins, um, and it always addresses the vertical relationship between a believer and God. And so it's a very sterile kind of faith. Justification by faith, for instance, when Luther first coined that term in the early 1600s, no, early 16th century, when he first coined that term, it was a revolutionary term, and it meant justification, as in justness, as in justice, for free.
Hmm.
What does it mean as a technical term in evangelical theology? It means to get off the hook with God. So God is something in the invisible realm, blah, blah, blah. Nobody knows what happens, but magically you're off the hook.
Hmm.
So it's a sterile term. It basically doesn't mean anymore. Anything anymore. It simply refers to a non-material fantasy in order to avoid material responsibilities.
That makes a lot of sense. I've heard it said that, I can't remember the name of the book, but it talked about the difference between how white American Christians and black American Christians, and again, there's nuance, of course there's nuance, interpret the Bible. And there's just, with white evangelicalism especially, and maybe other types of white Christianity, I'm not sure, but it's very individualistic. Like, anytime Paul's talking, it's not talking to y'all, to use my like Southern Georgian
Yeah, yeah,
version.
yeah.
It's not y'all, it's just you individually. So then, as long as you have done your vertical thing to deal with God, it doesn't matter the people that you've harmed. And then, whereas with Black Christianity, there's a deeper understanding of the, like, systemic things that are harming entire groups of people. And because they've been part of being harmed by these systems set in place. I used to wonder, like, how do we help when I was still a Christian, like, how do we help white Christians see this? But it was a chasing after the wind, to use like a Bible phrase, because
Yeah.
I saw very little desire to understand anything differently than what they did understand.
There is no desire on the part of white evangelical Christians in America, by and large, because there
Yes,
are
of
some.
course.
There are some.
Hashtag not all. I know. I know.
Yeah, but it is very disappointing. It is deeply disheartening.
Hmm.
And I had close friends at that particular seminary who are still close friends of mine. But when Philando Castile was shot by that police officer, that happened in my street, by the way.
Oh
That was
wow.
a street I used to walk every day. It's a very long street, and
Hmm.
still love that street. Larpenteur Avenue in Minneapolis,
Hmm.
or St. Paul, actually. Anyway, so my friends were white hot because the people were assuming things about the police officer and things were not fully investigated. So they were white hot about the police officer being on what do you call that in English?
Like leave, like
Administrative leave, I think.
okay, administrative leave. Hmm.
But they could not muster enough indignation for the nth shooting of a black person.
Hmm. Who had done everything he was supposed to in that situation.
Instead, I heard audio.
Oh,
Yeah, it's sickening.
I had family who their perspective went straight to, well, why was the woman recording? And it was like, because otherwise we would have never known what actually happened. Like this poor lady has to like extra traumatize herself to record this. I mean, it was just, I couldn't understand. Sorry, I have a hard time articulating this. I couldn't understand how someone being just point blank murdered by the police officer was not the like, clearly this is a terrible thing that we need to figure out what's going on. I don't understand why it's not understandable.
But for me, it highlighted my evangelical friends' inability to
Mm.
to understand or to even. And it's not like they hated blacks. Those people, well, they love black people. They had a very good friendship with their neighbor in seminary who was black. You know, at the same time, they can't see it and they're not willing to see it, and it's just mind-boggling. Mind-boggling.
Have you noticed? I noticed this in the church, and I know that the worship of whiteness goes way outside the church. Like this is not just a church thing at all. But white church people that I knew could have black friends and even use that as an excuse to never deal with any kind of
Yep.
thing that they may have done that was racist or see racist policies, but they could use that as an excuse. But it was like this bizarre, I can separate you guys from the way that I vote or the way that I, believe about police brutality or I don't know, capitalism. I mean, anything. There's so many different things that.
Yep.
Did you see the disconnect that people could?
Totally. Totally. I cannot figure it out, except that maybe um, as you when you're an evangelical, your world is in a sense very simple, um, because everything is your personal relationship with Jesus, and everything is seen from that perspective, and
Mhm, that little individualistic.
individualistic approach. So you're not able to even understand the systemic nature of politics and the socio-economic realities that surround you. All you can think of, we need a one issue here to make sure that the Christians come back in power, so we can
Ugh.
make sure that the Lord's will is done in this country that was founded as a Christian nation. But it's like even there, the thinking is extremely simple-minded, and um, systemic thinking does not come easy for evangelicals. And I know because I struggle to develop it, at a later stage.
I was part of the group for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thinking about Christian nationalism, what do you see happening over here with the Christian nationalism and trying to take back America and all that stuff?
Yeah, so I left the US in 2017, so I've had about 1 year or a good 8 months of Trump.
Hmm.
and I didn't know how quickly to leave the place
Yeah.
because it was becoming a very scary place. And I think America is a very scary place, and there is something deeply ironic. And I tend to revert back to the evangelical movement because I've been part of it for so long.
Hmm.
So in a weird way, I still identify with them. Like I talk about us, which is ridiculous because I'm never an evangelical. um, but so what the weird thing is this: they are warning against an apocalypse, an impending destruction of the world, and by their actions in voting in an absolute moron and moral monster, they are actually bringing about the demise of their own nation.
Oh, wow. That's,
That's how I see it. And I could completely exaggerate things here, but if I read some of the American media, not all the time, but there are people who say similar things like we're really sliding to chaos, anarchy, if we're not careful. And look at how polarized the American society currently is. There's even like Sean Hannity, or what's his name,
oh, Tucker
arguing for the pros
Carlson.
of what did he call it? um, breaking up the nation. They have a term for it.
Oh, Civil War? Is
No,
that
not
the
civil war.
phrase?
They have a euphemism of states breaking away from the whole of
I know seceding, but I don't know if that's the right word,
seceding, but
but
that's not the term they're using. Yeah. My goodness, where are you guys going with this?
it's sad because there's this strange inability to see the idea of patriotism and love of nation also bringing about what feels like the destruction of the nation that you say that you love. But the nation that they love, I think, is this mythical white supremacist world that I don't know that it's ever existed. At
Mhm.
least.
It's always a fantasy. People are always fighting for a fantasy, nostalgic fantasy.
And if you live your individualistic little Christian world, then if your daily life is fine, it doesn't register that when you go and you vote and you believe these different things, you're participating in what can make things way worse. But it
Yeah.
depends on also your thoughts of what's worse, because for us that sounds worse. But the idea of women having power over their own bodies, black and brown people having access to resources, to like upward mobility and more wealth and all these different things, that sounds bad to them, and
Mm.
I don't understand it. I have a hard time.
What I find very interesting is that evangelicals who always warned against postmodernism, ooh, be
Hmm.
careful, postmodernism, because that's like the evaluation of absolute truth. They are the most postmodern idiots I've ever seen. But then postmodern thought is great, but they are postmodern idiots.
That's
Like they will
fascinating.
blatantly lie to you when you confront them with something about Trump, or they will ignore it. Now keep talking about Trump. Trump is a little bit out of the picture, perhaps. I don't know. But like the public debates that are going on, like when there's obvious proof for something, they will just deny it, or they will flock behind Fox News and espouse the lies that are going on there. So I find that very very weird and ironic.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought about that, but that makes sense. The idea of relative truth, because I remember learning that was bad. You just don't believe that. Of course, there is objective truth, and yet here we are with those same very very many of those same Christian people perfectly fine with ignoring objective truth
Exactly.
and believing whatever, what is it, confirmation bias, whatever will already agree with what they've heard, which I know
Yeah.
we're all guilty of. I know that's true. So like, where are you now? What are, like, metaphorically, like, where are you now? What are you doing as far as, are you on a spiritual journey, or are you out, you're done, or yeah, where are
So,
you now?
so what happened? Because of my family situation, I could not simply return to
Okay.
to the Netherlands in 2012, and so in 2011 I applied for a PhD program
Okay.
in the same city, and I got in amazingly. and that was a mainline Lutheran seminary.
Oh, wow.
And I have to say that was a breath of fresh air. And though I'm no longer, I don't see myself as a Christian anymore,
Hmm.
but I still like Lutheran theology. And of course, Lutheran theology, there's the conservative kinds and that are not so interesting. But liberal Lutheran theology, or if you will, radical Lutheran theology, or where it intersects with liberation theology or feminist theology,
Oh, wow.
I have to say it's fantastic, fantastic theology. And I did my research on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is
Yes.
kind of famous in the U.S.
Hmm.
Um, um, Acclaimed by different factions of Christianity. But in order to understand Bonhoeffer well, I had to study Luther. So I have been back to the 16th century, and I discovered a minority report in Luther's theology. Even though he said about the or initiated the Reformation, which became super big, of course, um, it's probably fair to say that his discovery or his invention, if you will, uh, imagination of justification by faith and the theology that came to be known as the theology of the cross is actually kind of a minority report in Christianity and has popped up here and there. And it is always the story not of power. So the main story, the main narrative of Christianity is always about power. And how do you secure power? Either by apostolic succession, because then the first pope got the keys from Peter, who got the keys from JC, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that works. And then the other way is to say the word of the Lord. We have the word of the Lord, and it gives knowledge of how things work. So those have been two main strategies in Western Christianity to hold sway over the masses and exert power and gain political power. But the Minority Report says something very different, and it says, well, if Jesus is God's self-revelation, which we all are suggesting he is, then we can be safe. We're safe. It's safe to say that whatever God is always going to be contrary to our expectation because there you have a baby in a manger making dirty diapers. He could die anytime. He's in a manger, so he has poor parents, and he becomes a man of um, with a lot of grief and suffering in his life, and he dies on the cross. That's God. So the God you thought was sitting on the throne, the true nature of that God reveals itself or himself or herself as brokenness, weakness, as death. And so that kind of theology can never come to a consensus about this is the right doctrine or the right dogma. It is an ongoing searching that tries to subvert every construct it makes because every construct you make is already like trying to domesticate the idea of God. So that's very interesting theology, and I still like a lot of it, even though I'm no longer a Christian. And some of the best thinkers in Europe have come from that tradition. Think of Kant and Hegel and Heidegger. Not that they're all um, morally clean people, but they're very interesting people, and they've set the course. Nietzsche, he has a Lutheran background. Kierkegaard, so I really like the tradition a lot. I still do. And then toward the end of my studies, I came in touch, I was introduced to radical theology. And unlike the name suggests, radical theology is not theology. It's not a discourse that helps us connect with God, but it is the discourse that takes every God concept and then says, oops, look at that, wrong, something is wrong here.
Hmm.
It started with the death of God theologians in the 60s, if you've heard of them. There was an entire movement at that time of theologians that said that God had died. And what they meant is God had died culturally, or the way we do theology, we cannot do that anymore, or
Hmm.
Christianity is over and things have to go radically different. And so that movement has continued, and it is, again, a minority report because in the halls of official theologydom, that's the word, it's not recognized, it's not talked about, it doesn't get a place. but that theology is very radical. It's very subversive and antithetical, and that's the beautiful thing of it. It's a perfect tool to actually analyze society as such, and to analyze ideologies. And it has rootings in continental philosophy, um, like strong links with the thought of Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher who came up with the notion of deconstruction, which the evangelicals took over and turned into something else. And it has strong connections with the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, whose thought is also very influential in Europe. But it has a lot of connections with radical theology. And so it's exciting stuff. And I traveled down that path. And so I call myself a radical theologian, I guess, but not a Christian.
I am familiar with some of those names, mostly just the names. I don't know much more than that.
Mhm.
But that's fascinating. I love it. Is there anything I should have asked, but I did not ask that you want to talk about?
Um, well, let me just say that even though I'm not a Christian, I'm not against I'm not against religions or anything. But religions are complex, ancient ways, usually ancient ways, complex ways of understanding reality and bringing in morals and finding answers for questions. But because we as human beings, when we become self-aware and self-conscious, and we become aware of the nature of our lives as meaningless and as eventually ending, we get this anxiety that drives all human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And we devise strategies to avoid our end and to avoid facing the darkness in the eyes. And so the religions conform to the anxious human being, and then becomes a tool that is unhealthy. And so basically 99.999 of all God concepts are neurotic constructs to drive us away from ourselves. And so uh, therefore I'm not too excited about religions. But okay, if religions go, what do you get? You get something else, which is ideology. And ideology is just as bad. It's just God under a singular name.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the same drive toward away from ourselves and away from our fate. And as we anxiously avoid our fate, we try to trample other people and lord it over other people, seek wealth and seek diversion, and run away from the truth.
Yeah, it seems like if we're harming others and we're, I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for, like so attached, maybe that's it, attached to the ideology or the religion, anything that gives us meaning or just answers questions that we have, and we can't detach ourselves from it long enough to ask any probing questions, all the while harming other people and harming ourselves. Like that's not good. No, like no matter what version of that, whether it's an ism, a secular ism, or a religious thing. Yeah, it's true. It's
Yeah, but the problem is that both with religions and ideologies, we are not able to understand reality apart from it. There's just no way for us to do it. So during the years that I was an evangelical Christian, like conceptualizing that God would not exist was not an option. It's not that I could not say, okay, let me just play the atheist here and there is no God.
Mhm.
I can conceptually do it, but from deep from within, I was not able to conceive the world as plausible
Hmm,
without a God.
that's
And
fascinating.
so
Okay.
yeah, and so ideologically, if you look at capitalism, for instance, people who are not haven't thought about this long enough and haven't done the hard work, they cannot envision a world where the free market does not reign supreme. It
Hmm.
just it's not conceivable. Then how should we do it? You mean I should be commies? It's not conceivable, even though they can conceptually talk about it.
Mhm.
And so that is the problem with ideology and with religion. They are not just glasses through which we look at the world, but they are basically our eyes. They are our main instrument for understanding our reality. and they're often very unhealthy. They're anxiously driven, and we can see it. So we think we're normal people, or we think we're decent churchgoers, or we think we're pursuing a career in society, but all the while we're just driven by this thing deep down in us.
Do you know, and this is me thinking off the fly, what are your thoughts on like how do we help people not think in such a, well, if it's not this absolute thing, then it will only be this other absolute, this binary thinking, like helping people have nuance. Do you have any idea how we do that? Or is it like, well, it's not really our responsibility to do that to other people?
Yeah, it's possible by forging friendships with people who think different from you,
Hmm.
because knowledge is social, and so
I agree.
perspectives are transmitted socially, and that is a very good thing. Yeah. And also, I think we should be brutally honest about reality. And so I tend to say, like, there's a lot of people who would say life is meaningful. And I
Hmm.
say, no, life is not meaningful. There is no meaning in life. And you need to accept that before you can create meaning.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. I think humanist, I think it's what I would, I guess, put myself under.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I believe, humans, we make meaning out of things. Even when I was a Christian, I was like theoretically fine with when I died, I died. Like I wasn't, didn't feel any kind of way about that. In theory, I never got so sick that I might possibly die. And it came, face to face with it. But yeah, that's an interesting idea that we have to realize that life does not have meaning before we can begin to make meaning.
Yeah. And so what drives that is this. The moment we become self-aware, so we become old enough to realize, so mommy, are you going to die? The child asking that question.
Hmm.
And yep, one day I will, but it's a long way off. And then will I also die? Yeah, but that's a long way off. It's not going to happen anytime soon. Still, that moment is the moment where the conscious human being becomes, her true self.
Hmm.
So you need to face that. You need to not run away from it. And
That
um,
makes sense.
so once we can accept the mean, oh yeah, so this is what I was going to say. So what makes meaning for us is we try to turn the world or curve it into ourselves. So we become the center of the universe and make everything evolve around us, and that's how we think. We create meaning.
Hmm.
And sure, it works to some extent. And I'm not saying we're super selfish beings. I'm not saying that. But it's an orientation. Like the self has to be the center. The self has to achieve longevity or eternity, immortality. And if not for real, then maybe in the books I write, that kind of thing. Or in the memories, the things I leave behind for the ones I love. But once you can let go of self and kind of can accept that you're finite, so like throw yourself in that abyss of darkness and accept that even though it's maybe 30 or 40 years off, accept it is now. And once you can do that, then you can return to life and then say, I have a surplus on my back. And that's my life that I just lost. And I don't need to center it anymore. And so then you can start centering other people. And when you center other people, I guess the common word for that is love. And
Hmm, yeah.
when you use your life, your surplus, for the well-being of others, and you don't care whether you're remembered, or you don't care whether you're rich or poor, you just don't care because you've already lost your life. And then when you invest it in others, then you find the meaning of life. Because the meaning of life is to live, difficult word, exocentrically, or outside of yourself. But that's something that, because of our evolutionary upbringing or evolutionary origins, we can't do. Our self consciousness forces us to center ourselves in anxiety. And once we can overcome that, we, we find the meaning of life to help others, to be there for others, to give love.
Part of me, having been a woman in the Christian world for a long time, it's like, but that's what we did for all that. That's what I did. It's like,
And that's what you did. And that's totally unhealthy.
yeah, yes,
Yeah,
the
oh, I
not
agree
being
with you.
able. Like Brene Brown, I don't know if you're familiar with her work.
Yep.
She talks about the most compassionate people are people with boundaries.
Yep.
People who can like give and give and give and then say, no, I cannot give anymore. I need to be able to take care of my own self.
Arlene, I'm so
Yeah.
glad you're saying this because that is the absolute necessary addition to what I'm saying.
Because yes, you're
Proper
right.
self care comes first. What I am talking about is not like, just be the least, just be a
Oh,
servant,
yes.
serve your husband. I'm not saying that.
Oh yes, I know. I know. It brings up that same feeling, but I know what you're saying. And you're not the first who's mentioned it who are like loving other people, taking care of other people. Like cuz there really is a lot of truth behind that. Well, I was going to say pour yourself out for people. Oh, Christianese comes out all the
Christianese,
time.
Christianese, yep, yep.
But yeah.
That's not what I mean. It's just like if we can live decentered, then it's basically the Buddhist tradition. Once you can see yourself, so it's like the Jesus tradition and the Buddhist tradition coming together. Because Jesus said, if you want to gain your life, you have to lose it. It's like, what does he mean? What does he mean? What does he mean? And then quickly Christians turn it into, you need to be born again and saved. No, you don't need salvation. You need loss. But the Buddhist tradition is like once you can understand that you are an illusion, here
Mm,
it's like you find like that you're an illusion and you can let go of the desires, then everything is solved. There's no problem anymore,
I
and
like
that's
it.
it. But healthy boundaries. So, but it's weird. There is a component there of self care, and you can
Absolutely.
only truly love others when you are able to take care of yourself. Yep. No, I agree. I agree with that.
Yeah. Do you have any recommendations, podcasts, books, anything that you read as you were deconstructing or that you're reading now that you're like, this is so influential in my life?
Yeah. So I'd like to bring up one book, no, three books. One is then sort of the academic version. That's the Palgrave Handbook of Radical Theology,
Okay.
and it's not a cheap one, but it brings together thinkers over a period of 50 years in the area of radical theology. And what I like about radical theology so much is like, okay, once you leave the Christian faith, you don't have to become an atheist.
Hmm.
Atheism is often another version of a committed point of view about which we cannot say anything for certain. So why? And so it's like radical theology charts a course beyond the division between theology, faith on the one hand, and atheism on the other. Although it can be quite atheistic in its own way.
Hmm.
Then two other books. So one is a book that recently came out, and I haven't read it yet, but the author asked me to review her book for her.
Hmm.
And the author is Heather Hamilton, and she's from Atlanta. And the book is Returning to Eden, a field guide for the spiritual journey. So I thought it was so nice to mention that.
Okay. Yes. It has popped up a few different places in my Instagram. So
Yeah.
I've been hearing about this book. It makes me curious. Yeah.
And so I think it is a way for Christians who can no longer be evangelical to
Okay.
still do something meaningful with the biblical text and find a new way of making meaning out of it through a mythological interpretation. I think that's what that's my take on it. And then the third book is interesting. It's called Safer Than the Known Way, a Post-Christian Journey by Maria Francesca French. And she actually was in my seminary, so we're friends. And I just did a review on her book.
Hmm.
And so her story or her narrative in that book is very much like my own. It's post-Christian, it is radical theology, and it charts a course beyond the division or the antithesis between atheism and Christianity. And so I think that's a very interesting book for people who are done, who are really done with religion, and that might be a good book to pick up.
And I have found there are lots of people who they're done with religion, but they might still love Jesus. They might still,
Um,
have and for so many people, being a Christian was such a huge part of their lives for so long that it is, it's not always something you can just throw away. Like the language is still there, the some of the feelings are still there. Now sometimes it needs to be like, and we're done. Like completely. But yeah, that's not always a thing. So I've heard of the second author, or the Maria author. And then, yeah, Returning to Eden has popped up a few different places recently. So it makes me curious.
Yeah.
Okay. How can people find you online? That's how I found you. How can others find you?
Yeah, so I have an Instagram account, After God's End, where I usually post things that would make any Christian angry, and which are expressions of my anger toward Christianity.
No, I very much get it. I recently just posted to my like personal Facebook. I need a women's like Facebook thread where we can just be angry sometimes together. And I've had 3 people be like, I'm here for it. And so we have our little group that just
Yeah,
sometimes you just need to be angry with some other people. And then
yeah.
you feel a little bit better. Yep, I understand.
You're right. You're right. And other than that, as a theologian, I call myself a radical theologian, but on the other hand, I don't call myself a theologian anymore.
Hmm.
I've an interesting career now as a freelance copywriter,
Hmm.
and maybe I'll call myself a philosopher. I do that sometimes. And I tell people I studied philosophy of religion, which is actually very true as far as my PhD is concerned. Um, but I'm a copywriter, so I could give you my account or mention my accounts, but I'm on LinkedIn there, but I write a lot of Dutch these days because I've written thousands of pages in English, but no matter how much I try, it's never going to be as good as my Dutch.
That makes sense. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that
That's
totally
why I'm
makes sense.
enjoying honing my skills as a Dutch copywriter. And who knows, I will, pick up a book idea and work on it at some point.
That's awesome. Well, Josh, thank you so much for doing this. I had a delightful time getting to know you better. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Arlene. That was a great conversation.
My final thoughts on the episode. I really enjoyed that discussion. I love that Josh is using his platform today to just be a space to get his anger out, but also to let other people know that they aren't alone, that you can deconstruct the fundamentalist or conservative Christianity that you grew up with or that you've believed as an adult. And there are places for you to go. There is radical theology, feminist theology, womanist theology, queer affirming theology. Like there's so many other ways to look at the Bible or Christianity or Jesus and still love those things and appreciate them in a new way. I personally have thrown it all out and am fine without there being gods or goddesses or any kind of thing like that. But everyone needs somewhere that they can land if they want to land somewhere. And so this is good that this exists out on Instagram, and the online community that you're able to build on Instagram really is amazing. And so I'm glad Josh is doing that. And I've learned a lot from his page, and I know other people have learned a lot and will continue to learn. And so, Josh, thanks again for being on the podcast.
For the secular grace thought of the week, I really can't help myself but talk about the postmodernism and secular grace aspects of Josh's story. I've found it just amazing, having been a part of the church when the idea of being postmodern, to have truth be relative, the will to power to be a negative thing, something that was decried from the pulpit constantly, to find ourselves in a moment where the church seems to have embraced this entirely. Unwittingly, they would never obviously call themselves postmodern. They use postmodernism as an epitaph. The other interesting thing about that is that the way that postmodernism is used colloquially by the church is incorrect. Interestingly enough, postmodernism is really important for those of us who have gone through deconstruction and deconversion. And it's more than Derrida and the original idea of deconstruction that had nothing to do with religion, but more so the idea of modernism. Modernism was about having answers to life's questions, authorities that could be trusted. And postmodernism was a departure from that, the recognition that those authorities could be mistaken, were in fact mistaken, that the answers that we were satisfied with weren't good enough. In Dana Freibach Haifa's book titled Secular Grace, she draws a direct line from the Enlightenment to postmodernism to secular grace, and that in her mind, that progression is a healthy and natural one. Obviously, that's something that I agree with, but I appreciate when I hear someone else articulate secular grace without using those words. I think Josh was describing that, a focus on loving people, even serving people, to use that churchy word, is a part of this proactive love that I call secular grace. Next week is Holly Laurent from the Mega Podcast. Holly is amazing to talk to. She is a fantastic comedian, and I think you're going to love that. And also check out The Rise and Fall of Twin Hills, a satirical look at powerful pastors within the pretend world of the Twin Hills Church on the Mega Podcast. Check that out as well. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network.